During flight, a pilot's machine becomes an extension of their body, and the human body is complicated, driven by impulse and choice, locked in by habit. That's why a strong learning foundation is essential for a career in the sky. Training courses looking to churn out the next wave of pilots can often overlook this. Our guest today wants to see that change. Scott Boughton is the founder of Palisade Aviation, a Colorado-based company looking to refine flight training. We'll speak with Scott about his education philosophy and how we can equip the next generation of pilots with the skills they need for success. This is Push to Talk with Bruce Webb, Episode 3, A More Intentional Approach.
Good morning, Scott. Welcome to the show. And let's start just by telling us about Palisade Aviation.
Hey, good morning, Bruce. It's great to be here. It's always good to talk to you. I feel like we were just commenting before we started recording about how we get on the phone and talk for hours, it seems, about aviation safety and training. And I always learn something from the conversation. So I think today should be no different.
Right.
Palisade Aviation came out of a brainchild of mine a few years ago. I just really wasn't happy accepting B+ as the best we could do for aviation training. Too much emphasis is put on churning out another pilot, finishing this guy or gal up so we can send them out the door, and not enough emphasis is placed on decision-making and some of the processes we go through to get to the end. A successful outcome of a flight is not in itself an indication of a good flight.
Right.
It's just
Learning
not.
may or may not have occurred. Just because it was complete doesn't mean it was successful.
Sure. And, so I figured there's got to be a better way to do this. And I figured maybe I could go out on my own and try to help companies, operators, pilots, the industry in general, find a more intentional approach to operations and training. I don't think it's going to cost all that much more to do it the right way. So since then, I've met folks like yourself, Chris Hill and his team at HAI. There are a lot of folks out there that when I start talking about some of these ideas I have, will look at me and nod their head and say, yeah, you're kind of on the right track there, Scott. So I figure I'm looking forward to meeting all the rest of the people that are out there. Maybe through this podcast, there'll be some listener who will listen in and think, yeah, that guy's got a point, and get in contact with me and Palisade Aviation and see where we can go from there.
Is there any double entendre with Palisade? Where did Palisade come from?
It's really not all that exciting, to be honest. The name of my street name is Palisade. And I wrestled with a name to call the company and decided that actually having a company and actually moving forward with some of this work was more important than finding a catchy name.
Right.
So it's a beautiful location, and I think it's some really good ideas. So I figured maybe we'd just call it Palisade Aviation.
That is awesome. So yeah, Scott, I think that you're absolutely on the right track. Too often, I believe, and it's a human foible. It's not, people aren't doing this maliciously, but we look at the regulations and we say, well, 20 hours dual, 20 hours solo. The person, we can sign them off. They'll have their private. They fly another 110 hours. They have 150. They can take their commercial check ride and good to go. But that's not necessary. Those are the minimums. It's not necessarily recommended.
Right.
You can spend just a little more time. Maybe you spend 10 more hours with a person and you can improve their competency by twofold. Just by, you can add 20% flight time, but get 50% more value.
Right.
For that effort.
Absolutely. And I think one of the other stumbling points with the whole minimum hours or the planned hours, programmed hours, depending on what part of the CFRs you fall under, one of the problems is people will say, well, this is the minimum planned hours. I think it's 3 or 4 hours to basically go from zero to hero as a Part 135 PIC for a VFR helicopter.
Right.
3 or 4 hours. That's not enough time to really figure out that particular aircraft if you have no time in it. And if you don't meet the minimum requirement, the minimum proficiency requirement to take the check ride at the end of that 3 or 4 hours, management's looking for a way to send you down the road because you must not be a good pilot.
Right.
I almost didn't get a job one time. I'd flown the A-Star in the Gulf of Mexico. I had 700 hours of A-Star time. Hadn't flown it for a couple of years, had spent that couple of years in an EC-135, which made me lazy because it's a really easy helicopter to fly.
Sure.
Got back in the A-Star, and the instructor after the first flight said, I think we have an integrity problem. There's no way you have 600 hours in this A-Star. I said, I swear to you, sir, I do. The next hour,
sure,
found the button again, and he said, Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I almost sent you down the road. So we're so focused on trying to get somebody out in the minimum amount of time. And I think this comes straight from industry, the manufacturing industry, where we're constantly looking for ways to improve the process or find greater efficiency, or
Right. It's about
cutting
cost,
corners.
not value oftentimes.
Indeed,
So
yeah.
the cost, they look at someone and they don't say, well, you know what, if I expend a little bit more time, if I give this person 5 more hours of training, that has value because they will be an excellent pilot for years to come. They say, if I give that person 5 more hours of training, that's going to cost us $10,000. And perhaps I don't want to make that investment. But we must look at value, not cost.
Indeed. And I think one of the other potential pitfalls is people will then say, well, we're going to train to proficiency. And you know what the bean counters and the business folks have latched onto with that? Hey, we can do it in even less time. If you're proficient in less than the minimum hours, we'll go ahead and sign you off and send you down the road. And they're missing the point there as well.
Right.
So that 3 or 4 hours may be the minimum time it takes to learn how to do a normal takeoff, normal landing, max performance takeoff, steep approach, and slopes and quick stops and all the required maneuvers. But it may not be enough time to really learn how to put that. I mean, we're talking about money as well. So we need to put that machine to work to go make money for the operator.
Right.
So there may be a few more hours we could spend in how to employ the tool and some specific tips and techniques to make sure that the pilot actually knows how to do the job safely and effectively in that machine.
Sure. Yes, I was in a presentation yesterday, and he's actually one of our customers. His name is Arvid Albanese, and in the presentation he said, knowledge does not equal understanding. And so you may have knowledge about something, but do you really understand it? And it was in the context of the 56 second to live presentation that we did. And I kind of latched onto that and I said, that's true. You may have the knowledge to know that becoming inadvertent or unintentionally IMC is extremely dangerous, in fact, fatal, most often. You have that knowledge, but until you are in that situation or close to that situation, you may not have the understanding of that situation.
Right.
But I think anyone who's really encountered that or been at the precipice of that, they have understanding. And right, that's the job of flight training, not to put someone in a position that's harrowing or dangerous, but certainly as a student, it's your job as an instructor and as an organization to ensure they have understanding, not just knowledge.
Absolutely. And I think there's a way to approach our training in a way that focuses on the understanding. Another way to put it might be that they're focused on the correct process, or they're looking at what's important now, and what they're looking at as important now is actually what's important now. I have a good friend. He's an excellent pilot and a great instructor. And I work with him. I've done some simulator training with him over the past few years. And one of his favorite things to do is to give someone a FADEC failure in an EC-135 on short final. And the takeaway from that exercise for him is you got to make sure to check your instruments before you lower the collective because you might have had a FADEC failure. My thought to that is I don't really buy into that school. I'm thinking I'm applauding the pilot who has a minor overspeed when he lowers the collective, because where he's looking is outside, looking for the gurney that's approaching the helicopter with the hospital orderly who's not paying attention to the fact that the sheet is not attached to the gurney that may fly up in the rotor system, aware of his surroundings, making sure the crew's not unbuckling before it's time, that type of thing.
Right. And that is understanding your situation.
What's important now? Not to say it's not important to be aware of the aircraft systems and ensure we don't have an overspeed that's unnecessary. But
right.
When that pilot, if I give that scenario to a pilot in training, and they lower the collective and the rotor starts to overspeed, they pull the collective back up and say, hang on a minute, what is it? You gave me a FADEC failure. Let me go ahead and take care of that. A+.
Right.
The pilot who misses the fact that they've landed on the edge of the pad and rolls the aircraft over because they're too concerned about checking the caution panel for a malfunction because some simulator instructor might try to zap them. I think it's all with good intentions, but I think we can very easily focus on the wrong thing.
Right. And I do think that, it really teaches, it's scenario-based training. We need it. It's about knowledge and understanding. Yeah, if you have a FADEC failure, you need to apply the procedure per the flight manual. However, if you're on short final to a structure or there's any other, mitigating circumstance, fly the machine. Fly the machine. We would do similar things with fires. It's interesting. You'd have a fire in a simulator. You give a person a fire on short final. And quite honestly, you're 10 seconds from landing and you get a fire and you're landing on a rooftop pad. You may consider just going ahead and, proceeding either to, if you're going to fight the fire, then abandon the landing, fight the fire and land the ship on the ground if that's what you want to do. Or you may choose to land it on the rooftop. That may be your decision without fighting the fire. But you're absolutely right. Trying to fight the fire and land on the rooftop probably will overwhelm a person and could be the proximate cause of an accident. So we're a little less capable humans, not any individual. We're a little less capable than we think we are. We can become very myopic. And if you get tunnel vision, if you're worried about that FADEC failure and you slide off the rooftop, it really doesn't matter if you oversped the engine or not.
Absolutely. And you mentioned scenario-based training, and that's something that at least since, FITS SBT, came on the scene, the FAA really supports scenario-based training. Just like the piece of equipment we install in a helicopter and then forget to properly train the crew how to use it, when we have a tool like scenario-based training, that's kind of one of my things. I really enjoy that. I think it's a great tool, but we have to use it in the correct manner. I had a gentleman, extremely experienced pilot, designated pilot examiner, and he said something about, well, the FAA wants me to have a scenario as part of this evaluation, so we're going to have a scenario. So your scenario is you have to pick up this helicopter and fly to this location and drop off some people. There's your scenario. And I thought he was the examiner that day, so I kind of nodded my head and smiled. I just kind of went along. But the reality is, in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, so here's a guy, thousands of flight hours, extremely well-respected pilot and examiner, and he doesn't get it when it comes to scenario-based training. No hit on him.
I never trained. That's the problem. He was never trained.
Exactly.
In how to effectively employ scenario-based training.
The airplane people have it. I mean, and especially in Europe, they're a few steps ahead of us on this. But if you can focus on people's core competencies, their knowledge of procedures or their decision-making and problem-solving, and you can say the scenario is we're going to introduce an engine fire on short final to the hospital pad, and we want to see what you think is important. We want to evaluate that. We want to talk about that. It's not about okay, so you screwed that procedure up. Let's go ahead and sit on the ground and practice blind cockpit muscle memory. Where is the button to turn off the fire? Well, the thing's lit up. It's probably going to get your attention, and it's not going to be hard to figure out what button we have to push. That's not a skills problem. It's not a manual manipulation of the controls problem. The fact that you ignored the fire or the fact that you focused only on the fire, one of those, that could indicate what the real problem is. And then we find a different scenario that addresses the same type of issue, and then
see if there's a corollary or not exactly. A corollary. Right.
Yeah. So I think you can. I actually had someone else tell me when I was trying to explain some of these ideas. They said, "Oh, you're just overthinking it." I said, "No, I'm sorry. I think you're underthinking it."
Right.
That's because we can really get to the root of the problem and make some serious, long-lasting change. And the goal of any kind of training or education is to change ideas and change behavior. So we can actually do that if we take the time to design these scenarios correctly.
Right. But it takes time.
It does.
And too often, again, because of economics, people don't want to invest the time and the effort into developing things that are not required by regulation, but required to give the customer a good value. I think on maybe a more societal standpoint, we saw this with the pandemic and the educators at schools, primary schools, secondary schools, high schools, and a lot of teachers were challenged or tasked with doing remote learning.
Right.
So the schools bought, they bought high-speed internet, they bought computers for the teachers, they bought cameras for the teachers, and they ensured the students had a camera or a way to interact. And they said, okay, teachers, teach. But they didn't train the educators, the teachers, on how to properly provide remote learning, how to conduct remote learning. The belief was, well, it's just like teaching in a classroom, but you're not in a classroom. But it's not the same.
Not at all.
And so it's the same thing you're speaking about when we speak about people not really building good, well thought out scenarios to effectively teach a student, because if the instructor has not been taught how to do that, it's unreasonable to expect that most people are just going to be able to do it. It's a long road. Scenario-based training, I believe, is definitely the proper way to train, but we have to train the trainers first.
I think that's probably the most important thing. I mean, there's educating the management to help them understand how this is actually eventually going to help support their bottom line.
Sure.
And we also have to, if we have a large organization where our trainers are training a large number of pilots, we have to make sure the pilots are educated so they understand what they're getting into and what the difference is and what they can look forward to in their next simulator session, that type of thing.
Sure.
But probably the most important thing is making sure the instructors really understand what they're doing and are effective in
transmitting that information.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. So what else does Palisade Aviation do? What other, is training the preponderance of your work, or do you do other things through Palisade?
We're still kind of in the exploratory phase, figuring out exactly what the needs of the industry are and how we can fit in. I've had a lot of opportunities, but one of the biggest things it did for me was give me the time to be able to say, oh, you need some content for 56 Seconds to Live by next week? Sure, I'll clear my calendar because I'm my own boss. I can do that. In the meantime, still doing some of the part-time flying that I'm doing on the side. I'm still in the phase of figuring out what I want to be when I grow up. So,
aren't we all?
Yeah. So Palisade Aviation really is a framework with which I can operate in the industry and help people. I hate the word consultant, Bruce. I really don't. People say, "What do you do?" Oh, you're a consultant then. I'm like, gosh, there's no offense to consultants around the world, but there's a great poster out there that says consulting. It has a picture of a handshake and it says, if you can't be part of the solution, there's a lot of money to be made in prolonging the problem. So the idea is there are people out there who have projects like this or have ideas like this or hear what I'm saying now and say, yeah, that's exactly it. We want to try to move in that direction. But have you looked at our staffing lately? Can you look at our workload? You mentioned cranking out pilots and trying to get another one out the door so we can get the next one in there. They're overloaded. So a director of operations or a director of training or chief pilot can hear what I'm saying and say, we could just use some contract help, a worker bee to come in and just help us figure some of this stuff out, or even just write a new section of a training manual or that type of thing. So basically, I really enjoyed all the cool little side projects I did when I was an assistant chief pilot for a Part 135 operator. I just didn't enjoy all of the HR side of it and some of the other admin tasks that I was tasked with at that point. Hopefully Palisade Aviation gives me a way to go do a bunch of those fun little side projects.
Sure. For you, just like people. For me, and I think a lot of helicopter or people in aviation, I shouldn't just say helicopter pilots, but we want to be leaders, not managers. Leaders care about people. Managers care about money. And
Absolutely.
So, yeah, you weren't so interested in all the minutia. You wanted to be a leader and help people obtain their goals and be as competent and as successful as they could possibly be. And yeah, that's fantastic.
I'll add something to that as well. One of the kind of key moments that kind of let me know that, okay, I need to do something differently. I need to change. The environment that I'm in is not going to be one that's going to allow me to really fully realize my potential. Was when I had a manager who was senior to me that said to me, Scott, your weakness is you're not good at standing up and declaring yourself the smartest person in the room. And I looked at him, I tilted my head sideways like this, and I said, wait, what? He said, look, you want to gather all this information, you want to build consensus, you want to find all the details out, and you want to solve the problem in the best way possible. We don't need the best way possible. We need a B+, good enough. And you need to be the smartest person in the room and steer the conversation back on track and get things done. And I said, thank you for sharing that with me. That's going to really affect my career and really, really help me out. And it did, because at that point, I just never looked back.
Right.
That's not the part of the industry I want to be in.
Right.
Because I'm not especially in this room, I'm not the smartest person in the room. So if I'm the smartest person in the room, I'm probably in the wrong room.
I agree. I agree. We need to surround ourselves with people who have competencies that we do not. In fact, as a leader, that's incumbent upon us. We must seek out the people who are the best of the best. That's what leadership is. That's what training is. When your students depart, if they have a capability to be as good or better than you, they should be better than you. That's the goal. I find it fascinating when we talk about flight hours. People will ask, well, how many flight hours do you have? And I'm a little careful how I say this anymore because I don't want to sound too flippant. So I don't know what I always say, but what always runs through my mind is, well, how many hours would I have to say to make you believe I'm competent?
Right.
So you tell me how many hours you believe I must have for me to be competent.
And that's what I have.
And that's what I have. I mean, too many people, if they have 3,000 hours, then they believe you have to have 3,000 hours to be competent. If they have 4, it's 4. If they have 5, it's 5. I used to joke that you could tell how many hours the hiring person had based upon the criteria they asked for when they asked, when they're looking at resumes. If they needed 4,000-hour pilot, well, they probably had 5.
Right.
Yeah, and that's back on a different soapbox, but hours are just a poor measure of competency. They may be the only one that we have, but they're a poor measure of competency. I think we could all agree. My belief is, anyway, I won't say we'll all agree it's my belief, but I believe that an excellent pilot with 5,000 hours was an excellent pilot when he or she had 500 hours.
Absolutely. And going back to the scenario-based training and some of the more core competency type situation or type criteria, that's something that we can take the 5-hour pilot and we can train in a certain way to make them an excellent pilot at 500, so they'll still be an excellent pilot at 5,000 or 25,000.
Right.
That's actually, but that takes work and it's
time.
Intentional.
Sure.
What we've done by putting our requirements, and I do believe you probably don't want to sign somebody off for a private certificate without the minimum number of hours or commercial.
Sure.
Those numbers probably have some weight.
Sure.
But they don't necessarily mean the person is competent at that point. What we've done is we've found an easy way to quantify competency. And we've just kind of cut the corner of actually evaluating all the things that really show competency. I was talking to a gentleman just yesterday, and I said something about, I looked into helping people work with SMS or develop SMS for small operators. And SMS is a great initiative. It's awesome that the FAA is getting on board, and we'll see what happens with the SMS mandate for Part 135 operators. But if we focus too much on the data, we lose track of the day-to-day. And we're not actually, at that point, focusing on what really matters. And this guy got a little offended because he was a data guy. And he said, well, look, if I can't measure it, I can't manage it.
Right. Well,
I agree with that 100%.
That may be true.
But let's not find the easiest way to measure it. Let's actually do the homework and do the work to figure out a measurement system.
Does the measurement have value?
Right.
And if it has no value, right. You can have a lot of data. And too often people design data to tell them what they want to know. And, when we talk about flight risk assessment tools, and I know that's something you're very competent in building and surveying. And I think that happens often in a flight risk assessment tool. People build them so that you have to be, to use your phrase, sun loading upside down in a thunderstorm to reach a critical no-go.
Right. Someone I talked to a couple days ago used the phrase, well, we don't want a risk assessment tool that's just a fancy calculator. I couldn't have said it better. I mean, that's not, the goal is not, the person was responding to a question about what's a good number and how do you assign the thresholds and the values and the number system or color coding. It's really not about that. The whole risk assessment tool is supposed to get the pilot thinking about what are the things that are going to go bump in the night? What are the hazards that I'm going to encounter? How risky are those hazards? And then what can I do about it is the most important part of the risk assessment process.
It provides a structure for what we probably all have been doing throughout our careers, not just in flying, but in all things. But it provides structure. And through that structure, it should allow us to, put mitigating strategies in place to avoid, if not all errors, certainly the critical errors, and to learn from that. But it's SMS and flight risk assessment, those tools seemingly have been tough pills for people to swallow. People are gradually coming around, but it's been a difficult push, I will say. You mentioned 56 seconds, or I mentioned it. One of us mentioned 56 seconds, or your participation in that program. And I think that may be, I don't know that it's the first time we ever met or interacted, but it was certainly a time in my life where we spent a lot of time together, mostly via computers or Zoom.
Right. Yeah.
Because quite honestly, a lot of that happened. A lot of the work that we did was done during the pandemic.
Yeah.
And I will say, meeting you and learning about your past and about your competencies, and I've learned a lot. And I think that in working together on the 56 Seconds to Live LMS project that is hosted by HAI, that training course, of course, I don't think most people know. I think that you, just to tell the listeners, Scott, I would say he participated in 100% of it. He probably wrote 50% of it, and he voiced 100% of it. So, accolades to you. You did a fantastic job. So tell me about that project. How did you become involved? And tell us about the project.
Sure. Well, that was like a lot of things in life, something I kind of fell into. I'm currently the vice chairperson of the HII training working group. And as kind of a way to collaborate between the various industry groups, safety groups, training groups, we worked out a collaboration between our group and the U.S. helicopter safety team to provide some training help in developing the training for the learning management system training course that accompanies the 56 Seconds to Live video series. Initially thought I was going to be coming in to put my spin on, evaluate, second look at the training content that was out there. And
you didn't know you were going to write it all?
No. And the meeting, the first meeting I came to, one of the organizers said, "So what do you got?" And I laughed. And he said, "Oh, they didn't tell you." Yeah. So I said, "Well, I'll tell you what. Let me sit down, and I'm going to just use the first video as an example. I'm going to write out some learning content." There really wasn't too much of it. There was a framework in mind already for where the learning segments would go in the whole course. So I didn't necessarily have a hand in that. But I watched one of the videos and I thought, okay, so what do we want people to take away from that? What can we kind of revisit, kind of hit again, reemphasize, repeat, and see if we can get some good learning content here. I wrote a handful of questions, or some voiceover and some ideas for some graphics and some questions. I sent it back, and that's perfect. That's what we're looking for. So, okay. So I'll just keep going with the rest of it. Came up with a rough outline, and then we sat down with the group of us and basically, to use one of the gentleman's phrases, we kind of happy to glided a couple things, but we also found some ways that I got a little conversational in my tone and maybe needed to tone it down a little bit and make it a little bit more professional sounding. And we had a good laugh over my inverted sling load in a thunderstorm analogy for the risk assessment tool. And at that point, we were pushing a deadline and trying to figure out how we were going to get a professional voiceover artist to actually put the emphasis on the right syllable so we would get the intent through. I mean, because everybody who's listening to this podcast at one point or another has sat down for some online training, computer-based training, and they've listened to the voiceover artist, good intentioned as they are, spell out an acronym that everybody knows is actually sounded out, or vice versa.
Sure.
So I wanted to make sure we didn't do that with this content because we worked really hard on it. And then I just,
that was a volunteer.
Opened my mouth
You're
and
handling
said,
up.
I do have some equipment. I could try recording this stuff, see what you think. And I laid down a couple of tracks. Hey, that sounds great. And went ahead and spent the rest of March doing that.
Right. Well, you did a fantastic job.
Well,
and that brings us to something that if you're listening to this and you do have any comments, recommendations, criticisms about the course, so it's available free online, the 56 Seconds to Live course. We will likely revise that. So, what you will participate in when you go to the site right now is the first iteration. We will revisit it at some point and we will improve it. Hopefully we will improve it. So if you have some ideas about how to improve that, you can get a hold of myself or Scott at Palisade Aviation and, provide some input, and we'll certainly take that into consideration. I think back to those times, those many days. So Scott was doing, honestly, the majority of the work, and then myself, Nick Mayhew, Chris Hill, others, and forgive me for the others that I'm leaving out. I certainly must be. But I remember we would sit into Zoom calls, or we would just call each other on the phone, and we would sit down and hash over every point in the syllabi or on the script. And it's quite laborious. I think anyone who's written or done content like that would appreciate how difficult it is to wordsmith it so that it's understandable not only to an American, because Scott and I are both American, but our audience isn't just American, our audience is worldwide. So some of the terms that we use every day may not be as well understood by someone in Malaysia or Indonesia, China, wherever. It doesn't matter what part of the world. So we had to be very cognizant of that. And sometimes, quite honestly, you may listen to Scott's words and say, why did he say it that way? We don't say that, we say this. And it's because we were trying to make it, I guess, vanilla. We were trying to make it
vanilla, yet hopefully still interesting.
Yes, vanilla, but interesting. So you've done it for the 56 Seconds to Live. You did the yeoman share of that. Are there other projects like that, or do you foresee or have other projects in the works that you're working on now, or you'd like to do more of?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. That was actually, as we're talking here, something I wanted to make sure to mention. Kind of a companion to the 56 Seconds to Live training course. Actually, in the course, we mentioned some of the work that the HII Training Working Group has done on the same subject. There's a trio of 3 documents that the lion's share of that work was done by Mike Becker of Becker Helicopters in Australia. Really some brilliant writing and kind of boiled things down to like 3 main areas that people really need to be aware of when it comes to all things unintended IMC, pretty much. These documents are kind of like a textbook, someplace to go a little bit deeper. The document on decision-making is 106 pages long.
Wow.
and covers everything from the definition of VMC to what the components of a unintended IMC recovery plan to a review of some basic attitude instrument flying skills.
Right.
It's got a little bit of everything and a little bit of something for everyone. Those documents are now available on the HII website, rotor.org/education. So those documents are out there. We had a little bit of trouble just with resources to get 106 pages of documentation with legal considerations and just the publishing process of getting those documents proofread and put out by HII. They're out now. They did a great job. They look awesome. Encourage any of the listeners to check those out, and they can use them if you're trying to build a recover or inadvertent IMC, unintended IMC training course at your own operator. You use the 56 Seconds to Live course as kind of a springboard, get people kind of interested in it and kind of an idea of the whole big picture, and then dive deeper by checking these documents out.
It dawned on me as I'm sitting here listening to you speak, and Mr. Becker falls into the same category, but in the past, in our industry, the industry is largely started by people who were expert at flying and operating helicopters. And that same level of expertise does not necessarily make you an expert in courseware design or an expert in education or an expert in training. And it just so happens my eldest daughter, Allison, is a courseware designer. She has her master's in courseware engineering or courseware design. And, micro-learning and things like podcasts, things like videos, short, very focused, pointed training episodes are really fundamentally more valuable than, a movie. A long, drawn out. So again, going back to scenario-based training or going back to what you did with 56 Seconds to Live, that whole course is about an hour in duration, as I recall.
Yeah, it's about an hour.
Yeah, we tried to make it very pointed, direct, not superfluous, not repeating ourselves, and understandable. So again, when you use that course, when you go through that course, if you find errors, omissions, things that we can improve, please let us know, and we'll seek to do that. In that course, Scott, you described and talked about something called a mud map.
Oh, yeah. Ironically enough, that idea I got from Mike Becker. We were This was me doing a lot of the legwork and writing the content. It was not necessarily me dreaming up all the content. I was acting on behalf of the HI training working group, and I was doing the best I could to try to incorporate some of the concepts from these documents that Mike and the rest of the training working group put together. And one of those concepts is the mud map. And it's basically, if you take a cocktail napkin and a crayon and put a point A and then a point B, and then just kind of draw your path, how you're going to get there, and then make note of all the important things along the way. There's a ridge line here. There's a change of airspace there. I got a change of frequency over here. And it's a written mental rehearsal of the flight.
Right.
People who've been flying for years may look at that and go, yeah, I'm not gonna sit down and draw out in crayon my route. I'm just gonna get in the helicopter, turn on the Garmin, and go. But those folks might do well to actually stop and look at these mud maps and kind of see what kind of content's in there. And if they can honestly say that when they lift off, they're aware of all the terrain along the way, every route change or every course change they have to make, who they're talking to, what frequency that is, and they're familiar with that. And I'll be the first to say, for a simple flight, that's pretty fair to say a professional pilot would be able to just look at the map and go and be at that level of awareness. But if you're a junior pilot, and you don't really have that level of situational awareness just by taking a glance at the map, these mud maps these examples kind of give you an idea of the kinds of things that
Absolutely.
a professional pilot would be looking at along the way. And if you're a professional pilot and you say, oh, I'm just going to follow the pink line, I'll figure it out when I get there, you might want to slow down a little bit, go back to the basics, and maybe...
I thought it was brilliant. And to your point, if you're flying around, Dallas, Texas every day, and all you're doing is not all you're doing. If your mission is to fly around Dallas, and that's what you do day in and day out, a mud map may not be necessary for you. However, if you're from Butte, Montana, and you're in Dallas, Texas, a mud map might be nice. Or conversely, if you're from Dallas, Texas, and you're flying in Butte, Montana, you might find that as you traverse that airspace or you're doing a flight out there, it may be in your best interest. And even if you don't take it with you, even if you just sit down, like you said, on a, euphemistically, a cocktail napkin and draw out what you're going to do, at least it primes the flight in your mind. And I think that most of us would have to admit that when things don't go well in a flight, if you've prepared yourself either through drawing a mud map or at least studying the chart, whether it be on a digital device like a iPad or, those old-fashioned paper charts.
What are those?
Yeah, exactly. It may be the thing that, I guess I won't be so dramatic to say save your life, although that may be the case, but it certainly may lower your level of angst when you find yourself in a tight spot.
And it may be a overused or oversimplistic analogy, but I like to think of my brain like my laptop computer. If I open up too many windows in that computer and I have too many things running in the background, at some point I click on something and the little spinny wheel of death just sits there and looks at me for a while. The computer is just overloaded and it's not able to process that information. So on the other hand, if you have a process that's running in the background that's not taking a whole lot of memory, it doesn't slow down your thought process.
I think that is a great corollary.
Right. So now you take the, if part of my processor is being used to go, oh crap, I have to make a change. I have no idea what airspace is nearby. Where was that tower and had that terrain? I thought there was some terrain out here.
Or restricted airspace.
Or now I got to talk to somebody to get through some airspace. What was that frequency? If I've already looked at that once, it significantly shortens the amount of brain power I need to use on those basic aviation skills so I can focus on dealing with the task at hand. Because we know things don't happen in a vacuum. We have the bad weather. We have that situation we have to divert. Somebody on board is sick or something else goes wrong. That's also the time we're going to get that flickering light on the caution panel. What? And if it was a solid chip light, that makes it easier to know what to do. But what about that time when the light flickers, we see the flicker, but then it goes off and we're not sure what it was? Now we're using part of our brain to try to figure that out. So the more we can do ahead of time to be prepared, and that's the whole point of the mud map, is to kind of lay all that out ahead of time. And then quite honestly, when you look at that and you say, oh, there's that big ridge line right there. Well, where are my weather reporting points? Well, I've got 2 weather reporting points along the route. One's on one side of the ridge, one's on the other. They're both reporting 1,000-foot ceilings. I've got VFR ceilings. Off I go. Well, wait a minute. The ridge line is 1,100 feet.
Right.
There's a pretty good chance I'm going to get, and I love reading, I don't say I love reading. I actually somewhat smile and somewhat, face palm when I see the incident reports that say, or even just a weather turnaround report. I took off, bound for this place, the weather was good, and I ran into deteriorating weather along the route. No, you ran into the weather that was there, and if you had taken the time to think about it, you would have known that it was there.
Sure.
But you didn't do the whole plan. You didn't look at the whole picture.
A little bit of planning, and again, it's a human. It's what it is to be a human. Oftentimes we believe that if you're a competent aviator, you can cope in flight with the elements that you maybe overlooked prior to flight. In other words, that's the mark of a competent aviator, but in fact, it's not. The mark of a competent aviator is knowing that if you spend a few minutes, and honestly, if you really take the time to measure how long it takes to step back from the event, measure, check the weather closely, do all the things that we know we're supposed to do, draw a mud map, evaluate the what ifs. I often say that if we look at an event, and I don't want to say an accident, I'll just say an event. If we look at an event and we imagine on every flight what could be the event that stops us. In other words, you and I are going to get in a ship, we're going to fly to Butte, Montana today. And we pre-flight, we plan, and we're going to go IFR out there, and we set it all up, and then we ask ourselves, if we get into an accident, what will be the root cause of that accident? And you look at the planning that we've done and you said, well, Bruce, that second leg from, B to C, that's stretching our fuel just a little thin. If we get in an accident, it could be because of that. Then we say, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to, when we're halfway, when we're, whatever point where we can make a change in our flight path easily. So let's just say halfway between point B and C is another airport with turbine fuel. We say, okay, we're going to fly there. And when we get to that point in our flight, if we don't have if our balance of our fuel does not allow us to continue and land with our reserve, then we will stop right there and get fuel. We will not pass that mark. We put a mitigating strategy in place.
Right.
It takes a few minutes. It just takes a few minutes. But if you don't have a plan in place, it's more difficult to develop one in flight. It really is. And quite honestly, not only more difficult to develop in flight, oftentimes we just don't pay any attention and don't develop one in flight. That's how I like to look at planning. It's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of intelligence. It's a sign of, doing it right.
Yeah, and even the operators who are in a more time critical role, like the helicopter or ambulance industry, it's not okay to say, oh, well, it's okay for those guys to just jump in the ship and go because they have a really important mission to do. Well, their most important mission is to bring the ship home at the end of the flight and to make sure we're going to do like the doctors do and do no harm here, right? So it's okay to take that extra 30 seconds because it really only takes an extra 30 seconds to a minute or so. I mean, we don't want to necessarily say,
correct,
okay, I've done a 30-second planning, so I'm good. That's not enough planning in some cases. There's more than enough in others.
Absolutely.
So, and when you mentioned the fuel example, I think, and this is something I've asked a number of risk assessment tool manufacturers and developers, how do we capture the effect of different hazards that when added together, like chemicals by themselves, they're
potentiate
inert,
one another,
but they blow up when you put them together. How do we capture that in a risk assessment tool? So when you say the weather or the fuel situation up in Butte, Montana, leg B to C, we're going to be a little bit tight. We have a place we can go. We get to that point midway. We have enough fuel to make it to our destination. We've kind of hit our point of no return, but we didn't keep track of the fact that there's some questionable weather along the way. And that distance we were able to make, that planned distance for fuel, is based on a certain airspeed and a certain fuel burn.
Absolutely.
And now we slow down to 60 knots because we're concerned about visibility and the weather. We're thinking about the weather, and then we look down, we see that flashing low fuel light and go, uh-oh. So we've basically done lip service to the fuel thing, checked the block, moved on. We have to continue to consider these things as the flight progresses.
Right. And it may be something as innocuous as you depart from point B at 11 o'clock, you're due to land at point C at 1:30. And when you need to make those critical decisions, you are low on fuel. You have not fed the machine. You are not nourished.
Right.
And, we are not robots. We are not computers. We need to be well nourished to make good decisions. When you think about the number of times in your life you've made a bad decision, my prediction is you are either A, fatigued, or B, hungry, hadn't eaten properly. And in many cases, it's both. And again, I don't want to be preachy here. I've done, I'm 58 now. And a lot of what I know because I did those dumb things. I would stop at a fuel stop, eat a Snickers bar. I mean, quite honestly, a Coca-Cola and a Snickers bar was kind of the
aviator's breakfast.
You're right. And that's insanity. You wouldn't put turpentine in your helicopter and wonder why it does not run correctly. So putting a Snickers bar and a Coke, no offense to Snickers or Coke, but that cannot be, those are snacks. Those are treats. That's not proper fuel for the human body. So we must feed ourselves correct and nourishing food, get the appropriate amount of rest to make good decisions. And so if at the time, you're midway between B and C, that's where you're going to make your fuel decision. That's where you're also tired, and maybe also where you're hungry. All those factors potentiate one another. And the outcome may be, this is too much. We shouldn't be in that position. And I know people don't like that sometimes. They're like, sometimes you just got to make it happen. You got to get it done. Well, unfortunately, the industry is rife with fantastic pilots. They were fantastic. I think most pilots that you read in an accident report, I don't think they were bad pilots. They made an error. And what allowed them to make that error? What decisions did they make that put them in that place? That's what we have to resolve.
That brings up a good point. I think a lot of times we as pilots put pressure on ourselves that's self-induced. We say that, management pressure caused me to take this flight. Was it really management pressure, or was it what you assumed would be management pressure? I think more often we're finding people at the top of the organization that understand the need for active risk management and making good decisions, and that no is sometimes 100% the only answer for that situation. But then when it actually comes down to making the decision, nobody wants to fail at getting the job done. People want to make it work. They don't want to stay below the radar and not make waves in the organization. They don't want to be that pilot who's always popping up for saying no, that type of thing. But just like the FAA says when they come out and make it very clear, look, do the right thing. There may be an investigation, but we're not looking for a way to hurt you with this. We just want to know some information. And the number of times people have been asked to file paperwork for declaring an emergency is actually a lot lower than people think. That's another one of the points we make in the 56 seconds course. Declare the emergency, get the help you need.
Right.
If you have some paperwork to do, you can take your very living fingers and fill out the paperwork versus,
right.
I avoided the paperwork. That should be what they put on your tombstone. Well, he avoided the paperwork.
Right. Well, it is, not to laugh, but you're absolutely right. I think many people don't realize you're only required to file a written explanation if requested, and that's within 10 days of the event, I believe. Someone can fact check me, but I believe it's within 10 days. So, I can declare an emergency. I can do all sorts of things to safely affect the resolution of that flight safely. And the fact that I declared emergency does not require me to file anything unless requested. And oftentimes, to your point, Scott, it's not because they're trying to violate anyone. It may be because someone wants to understand better, and maybe understand better so that they can help others not fall into the same trap. Part of that is, again, back to human behavior. We worry a great deal about things that never happen, and we discount things that are right there, right in front of us, about to hurt us. But, I think when we discussed this many times during the 56 Second to Live work, that my belief is many of the pilots who are now deceased that were in that environment within that last 56 seconds were probably worried about being violated. But to your point, you don't need to worry about being violated. First of all, it's unlikely to occur for a lot of good reasons. Second of all, being violated is a whole lot better than being dead.
What is the phrase? Better to be judged by 12 than carried by 6?
There
is
you
that
go.
how it goes? Yeah.
Right. So you've been married for many years?
10 years in October.
10 years in October, yes. And Julie is with you here today, but unfortunately couldn't join us.
Right. Yeah. I think if she had known, kind of sitting in and watching the process would have been an option. She may have wanted to come by. She's a professional musician, so pretty much in her entire career, I've been able to go see her perform in concert in various, venues and with various groups and ensembles.
Awesome. What did she sing? Does she play an instrument?
She's a flute player.
And
she plays flute with the Air Force Academy Band in Colorado Springs,
Oh,
Colorado.
you know what? I did know that.
For years, I've been going I've been the groupie that kind of tags along and watches her perform and everything. And she came to see the presentation I did at the HAI Training Working Group Town Hall yesterday afternoon, where we kind of laid out those documents I was telling you about earlier.
Sure.
And she thought it was kind of cool to actually sit in the audience and watch me perform. You know?
Right.
So it would have been cool for her to come here today and just watch the conversation, although I probably would have been nervous, with her wondering how many times I said or ah, while my professional performer wife is watching.
Well, it is interesting you say that. And I think part of being a great flight instructor or someone in education, whether it's flying or not, is it's an art. I believe, when you think about writing scripts for the 56 second or voicing it over or combining that concept with a visual, all that is artistic. I would be the last person to ever consider myself artistic. But since the pandemic and we had to shift immediately into a way to disseminate information that was no longer in person, I guess a lot of what we do now has a component that is artistic. I mean, even doing a podcast. I mean, we're sitting here in front of these microphones and I never would have believed 2 years ago.
Right.
So I do think that a lot of your creativity is similar to her creativity. You just channel it differently. She's channeling it through a flute and you're channeling it through aviation education training.
Right.
But where do you see yourself, or where would you like to be 5 years from now? Do you want to delve more into structuring courseware? Do you want to help others design courseware? What's your goal? Where do you see yourself in 5 years?
Ideally, where I see myself, I think 5 years is a fair window to look at. I still want to keep flying, and that's actually something I still really enjoy doing. That I work as a part-time check airman and flight instructor for a Part 135 operator. I do some line flying for them on the side, and one of their sister companies builds Firehawk helicopters. So I do production test flights on those, and I'm getting into the test flight world, which is something I didn't have a ton of experience at before, but I'm expanding my horizons. I just finished up some fixed wing ratings, and I'm now looking for opportunities to go fly right seat and whoever will take me to go get some experience as more of a long haul kind of airplane guy. So I still, bring me a kite or a balloon, I'll fly that too. I still really enjoy the actual act of piloting an aircraft. And sometimes it's fun to just be the pilot and not have to be talking the whole time or sitting on the left side and just watching someone else fly or helping them, having to explain things all the time. I do enjoy instructing, but I also like flying as well. So 5 years from now, I'll be on 3 or 4 different companies' books as a part-time pilot and kind of flying whenever I feel like it. I'd also, with Palisade Aviation, I hope that really turns into an opportunity for me to work with a variety of different companies, whether it's a flight school or whether it's a Part 135 operator or another company out there who's doing high-level training, to be able to just be a contract helper to do small projects here and there. I guess I'm still at the point in my life where I guess maybe I will be forever. I don't like getting bogged down in one particular area for too long. That's not to say that I get bored necessarily, and I'll definitely have the stick-to-itiveness to finish the task, but I'm looking forward to the opportunity to kind of have a variety in what I'm doing. So I'm sure next year, when we record next year's version of this podcast, I'll have 3 or 4 ideas of different directions I'll want to go.
That'll be fantastic. Yeah, I look forward to that. Yeah, I have to believe that people with your skill set will be sought out more and more as time passes. Because as I said earlier, I believe that the ability to develop effective courseware is not something that's innate in just helicopter pilots. We don't wander around. Most of us are, again, we started our careers because we love to fly. And many courseware developers are not expert helicopter pilots. So to have the talent in both areas is awesome. I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity. I think that as an industry, we're learning that a very good, well-developed, tight course has an upfront cost, but the downstream benefit of that is enormous and long-lasting. All the effort you put on the 56 Second to Live program it's already been out for months. This version will be out for, I'm sure, at least an equal amount of time until we revise it. But those live, so it's difficult to quantify or to measure what was the price, but we do know the value.
Right.
And I'm proud to know you. And
thank you.
I think your biggest issue is going to be not spreading yourself too thin,
right,
because there's going to be a lot of interest in the kind of work you can do. I thank you for being here. I really do.
This has been great. I've had a real good time.
And I look forward to next year. Maybe it won't even be a year. Maybe.
Yeah, who knows? Yeah.
Perfect. Well, we've reached our clearance limit. Again, I'd like to thank Scott for being here today and for his insight and safety advocacy.
The information provided during this podcast, Push to Talk with Bruce Webb, is made available for general information and educational purposes only. The views and opinions expressed do not necessarily represent those of Airbus Helicopters, Inc. or its affiliates.